Welcome to this week's Riks Round Up by Riks Europe. My name is Hannah and I am joined by political commentators Elias Nordgren and Peter Klippe. Welcome back.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you.
Today we will be covering the topics of President Javier Milei that scored a political win on Sunday. We will also talk about the tensions with the EU trading partners China and the US. And lastly, we will discuss an Antwerp judge that warns that Belgium is a narco-state. So let's start to introduce the first topic. President Javier, he strengthened his position in Argentina's Congress. Elias, what can we say about this?
So this is the midterm election of Argentina that was held this weekend, and Javier Milei has been this very prolific libertarian president for a couple of years now. He's had his ups and downs. He's met some opposition, a lot of opposition actually, to what he's doing, and for some time it actually appeared as if his project of restructuring the entire Argentinian economy wasn't really going to work out. There was a lot of popular opposition to many of his reforms as well. We saw rising unemployment, and even though the inflation went down dramatically during his owing to the reforms that he's carried through, it hasn't always been enough to actually sway people to believe that Javier Milei has been the salvation of the Argentinian people. But this election actually proves that there's a lot more support for him than what might previously have been assumed. So they had an election for some of the seats in the Chamber of Deputies and some of the seats in the Senate. So it's not a nationwide general election. This was just only concerning a number of seats, but it showed a remarkable turnout for Milei's supporters. So that means that they now have 40% control of the Chamber of Deputies, and they won. I believe they doubled their presence in the Senate as well. And this has essentially meant that Javier Milei is going to maintain his veto as president that he has towards any new legislation that might come to overturn some of his more controversial policies. This means that's not going to happen now because he has managed to secure a very quite wide margin of support in the Congress. So that's very positive news for him, and it was a bit of an unexpected development, actually. But we'll see where he takes the country from here, if he's going to be able to fulfill his libertarian promises or not. There's a lot of things that could happen.
Yeah, it's really great to see Milei winning so much more than people had predicted. There were a few scandals. There was a bad election in the province of Buenos Aires, where you have traditionally a lot of strong leftists, Peronists, they call them, in Argentina, the people that have brought the country from one of the richest countries in the world, Argentina, 100 years ago, to really a basket case. It's the only example people say of a country going from a first world country status to going back. Now, Milei is trying to change that, as you said, Elias. He has successfully reduced inflation. It's still very high, but he has a great success in that. He slashed many regulations, also in the housing market. So he liberated the rental market, and as a result, surprise, surprise, many more people were offering rental units. So this was a great thing for ordinary people, and you can see that Milei is actually quite popular among the economically poor part of the population, surprisingly. He also did quite well this time around in Buenos Aires province. So yeah, I mean, it's an enormous win, really. Even if he still does not have a majority in the parliament, he has a minority government that is reliant on sort of the center right, the more, let's say, the bourgeois right, for lack of a better term. But they will be happy to support him, and they will not be able to make as many demands as they hoped they could. So yeah, this is all going swimmingly. Maybe one more thing, we should say that some pure libertarians have criticized Milei for not going far enough. But then, if he would say, look, we will default, we'll no longer pay back our debts, and anybody that has been, lending money to Argentina knew that it was a basket case. That's what they deserve. This is, of course, the real position of Milei. That's what he would love to do. But we all know if he would do that, that he would be kicked out from power right away. So he's actually quite a conservative in the sense that he tries to do things gradually in order to make them happen, in order to also minimize the shock and the transition, especially for the poorest. He is even conceded to a number of subsidies, but in the process of having to do that, he had to take money from the IMF, even from China, and also, as has been widely publicized, from the Trump administration indirectly, through some kind of a complicated swap agreement, but that was effectively financial support from America. Now, the West has been propping up many countries, but at least in this case, Argentina is really trying to, introduce liberal reform, hard money policies, really standing on the side of the entrepreneurs and the people that want a better life, and not on the side of those that want to take advantage of the system. So I mean, he's not only important for Argentina, but in this way I think he's really a model for the rest of the world.
I think there's something to be said about his approach to actually, reforming the Argentinian society in a libertarian manner, because many of his opponents, obviously, a lot, the way that people talk about Milei, obviously, has been this very caricature-like presentation of what a libertarian is like. He's going to slash literally the entire state. There's going to be no public expenses, for example. That's usually what the opposition has to level against him and his party. But ordinary people can see that this is not actually the way he's going about. He's going about things very carefully. And even though this is attracting some criticism from some more or less, Puritan libertarians, he's making a difference in people's lives, and they can actually notice that to a large extent. So it's going to take a while probably to turn the ship around, but he's working at a pace that is admirable, actually, for someone with his characteristic type of background. He could easily have been a radical who was just going to undo literally everything overnight that the Peronist governments had done. But he didn't. He chose not to do that because it's not maintainable. It's not sustainable in the least. So kudos to him for that.
Exactly. And maybe one more thing about Milei. Some observers expect that he will also be much tougher on crime now. Argentina, like many Latin American countries, has a big problem with crime, and of course this is also hurting the weakest in society. And he's following the model of President Bukele in El Salvador. Now, Bukele has had his critics, partly justified. Human rights have not always been respected, to be fair, in his fight against the Maras, these nasty narcotics gangs. But these people were terrorizing the whole country, right? So the question was, do you continue to allow them to violate the human rights of everybody? Or do you say, look, we have a warlike situation, we're going to temporarily restrain the human rights of these select group of criminals? And it's, of course, very dangerous if you allow the state to do that, but at least any statistic shows an amazing success. And it's interesting to see that in the region, and maybe in the future, the rest of the world, we will see other countries following the policies of El Salvador.
As interesting as it is time for us to discuss our next topic. As we introduced in the beginning, there seems to be some tensions between the US and China as trading partners. What's going on here?
Well, indeed, US is stepping up its tensions with China, but so is the European Union. Now, this goes beyond Trump and the current von der Leyen Commission. For a long time, there has been unease about the economic rise of China. There has been accusations that China doesn't play it fair, that they have subsidies, that they steal trade secrets. And a lot of that seems to be justified. There's little debate on whether that's true or not. The debate is, okay, what do we do with it? And the United States has been pressuring the Dutch government, the caretaker government, to take control of Nexperia, which is a company that produces sort of mid-level sophisticated semiconductors, chips that are made, that are used for many things. but for example, that are used for car manufacturing. So as a result of this, the Chinese government, which was angry because the company that had been sort of seized by the Dutch government was owned by a Chinese company. So China was angry and they started to restrict rare earth materials for Europe and some semiconductor exports. And as a result of that, the German government was alarmed because many of these chips, semiconductors, are used by Volkswagen. So we see that we're talking about really complex supply chains, that if you take out one thing, that a whole production process may come to a halt. Volkswagen was announcing that they only could produce for a bit more than a week unless this was being resolved. Now, in the meanwhile, Ursula von der Leyen, she is threatening to step up action against China. France wants her to use the anti-coercion instrument, which is some kind of new European Union tool to take action against countries that are perceived to behave bad economically, whatever that means, in cases where the World Trade Organization does not allow sufficient response. So to be fair, everybody's really looking at a solution to that. But it must be said that in the process, the EU has not actually been friendly to any of its trading partners. It has been trying to export its regulations, to the rest of the world. Last week, Qatar and the United States together told the EU that it had to shelve its CSDDD. They always have this communist style regulations, which is the due diligence regulation of the EU. And this means this regulation that the EU asks companies to introduce a whole set of information, or it forces companies to come up with a whole bunch of information about its supply chain, to what extent it protects social and environmental standards. And of course, if you do international trade, you cannot expect companies to do that. It's very complicated. We have very long supply chains. So that's interesting that the rest of the world is pushing back against this EU madness. Also the deforestation directive, the European Union imposing very bureaucratic obligations on companies. They basically have to show that there's no deforestation in their supply chains. Because of the pressure of Trump, the EU has said, look, America is effectively exempted, but then other countries like Indonesia and Malaysia are angry about that because they actually made a lot of progress. Especially Malaysia had like 13% less deforestation. And now their companies need to comply with super bureaucratic new rules, whereas the American companies do not. So that's another thing you see, that when the EU tries to play world regulator, that they end up with double standards because some countries don't accept that. Another thing is CBAM, the climate tariff. America is going to be exempt effectively, but now South Africa is angry about it. African economies will be badly hurt by this European Union protectionist tariff. So South Africa says, look, you have to also give us some concession. So of course the solution is, as difficult as it is to deal with China and the rise of China, that at least European regulators should not play world regulator. They should just focus on opening up trade, and and that's already difficult enough.
Yeah, and I thought they said that China would be the EU's new partner, coming the election of Donald Trump. They said, oh, all these tariffs are going to destroy this like free trade order that the EU is relying on. That means we're going to be able to trade more with China. We're going to have to trade more with China. Well, obviously that didn't really work out, because it turns out if you dismantle the way Europe has done, Europe has been doing, if you dismantle your security that you had built up for centuries, really, in the regard that European politicians have done for such a quite long time, the regulations being one part of it. Obviously, we're damaging our own economy and our own manufacturing sector with our own industries with many of these regulations. but it's going to come back and bite us in the rear, obviously, and that's what happened in this case, for example. I mean, if that China actually owned one of the major Dutch um, um, the chip manufacturer that you mentioned, it's just an
Xperia.
insane development. Yeah, an
Mm.
Xperia. It's just an insane development that you wouldn't obviously have to have this happen, but they opened up the floodgates to this type of development, and now they're shocked that the world is a lot crueler than they expected it to be. They expected, well, the EU bureaucrats expected the EU to always sit on top of everything, but the EU is not on top of everything right now, due to the overregulation, due to a a number of factors that have decreased Europe's attractivity as a place of business and of industry and economic growth. We don't have that anymore, whereas China does have that, and obviously the United States also has that. So that leaves us with this very cumbersome bunch of regulatory apparatus that we have in Europe that we're not going to be able to get rid of because of how much the continent has as a whole has invested in this stuff. We've been trying to export this, as you mentioned. We've been trying to export this to many of our trading partners, but it hasn't
Mm.
worked. So we've been barking up the wrong tree for a number of decades, and now we're reaping what we've sown. I say we. Obviously, we're talking about the globalists, the EU bureaucrats, but this affects every European, and yeah, many people saw this coming, but they were ignored. They were ridiculed, and we're all paying the price now.
Very interesting. Our last topic, as we said, an Antwerp judge, he actually wrote a letter to the federal government asking for urgent help. And he warns that Belgium is a narco state. What can we say about this?
Well, Hannah, actually, interestingly, this was a lady. It was a female investigative judge, and she was studying how, she really has to fear for her life while investigating the narcotics mafia, which is very big in Belgium, sadly, because the port of Antwerp is the second biggest port in Europe after Rotterdam, and lots of narcotics, cocaine, heroin, whatever. It's all coming through the port. It's very difficult to check everything. And we're talking about a massive market and a massive illegal market. So the organized criminals, they have lots of resources. And what they do is they offer 100,000 euro for 10 minutes of work to some of the port workers. They have infiltrated in the port management. People there have been arrested. They have infiltrated in the police, in the justice system. I mean, also the current Belgian Prime Minister, Bart de Wever, who used to be the mayor of Antwerp, he has been warning about this development in the past. Yeah, so she basically said, what are the characteristics, she said, of a narco state? Well, it's that you have a big illegal market. Check, we have that. That you have the narcotics mafia infiltrating in parts of the institutions. Check, we have that. That you have them buying up real estate, which drives up the prices of real estate in parts of the big cities. We have that. So yeah, this is all very very concerning. Personally, I've always been wary of the war on narcotics. I think if you have such a big illegal market, we've seen in the 1920s with Al Capone in Chicago that if you ban alcohol, that you create a massive market for criminals. Now, don't get me wrong, I think we should be much harder against the criminals and the criminal activities, but on the long term, we should really consider, okay, does it make sense to outlaw all of this while many people are consuming this and not necessarily harming anybody else but themselves, because these are obviously very bad products. But the question is, should we not allow people to make that choice themselves, and in this way then take massive resources out of the hands of organized crime? At least that's the position of Vicente Fox, who's the former president of Mexico. Mexico had to deal with similar problems. He thought, look, it's better to legalize it. Now, that has, of course, not happened. Now, Mexico has turned completely into a narco state, not as bad as Venezuela yet, but the Americans are very concerned about this, rightly. it just throws up very big questions. Yeah.
I think one of the problems with decriminalizing many of these narcotics is that it's going to institutionally legitimize many of these criminal organizations that are in the in the drug business, obviously. So we're going to see that many of these businesses, these organizations, are going to essentially transition into legal businesses. Is what I fear is going to be the result of such of such an approach. Now, I think, as in many problems that are raging in Europe, this is to a large extent an immigrant problem, because I mean, you're talking about the infiltration of various institutions of society. The way this usually happens, especially in Sweden, where we have very very dramatic experiences of this, is that these gangs that are often based around a clan network, usually of Middle Eastern origin, obviously, they find their ways into various institutions where they are able to execute in various ways the will of whatever criminal organization or operation that they're spearheading. So we've seen this in courts, for example. We've had prosecutors that have been related. They've been cousins to some of the greatest kingpins of the Swedish criminal underworld, a clan of, or whatever you want to call it, of Iraqi descent. So this is something that I think is also plaguing Belgium, obviously, as in every Western European country that we have had mass uncontrolled migration into. We've seen this increasingly more violent and increasingly more just like despondent criminality that it brings with it. So narcotics is one of these things that we haven't really. The narcotics business wasn't that big of a deal in Europe before mass migration, I would argue. I think that this is something that has really entered our continent through under the with multiculturalism, because many authorities in Europe have been very reluctant to actually keep a check on many of these people that are now engaging in criminal activity. They haven't been willing to call out these patterns that they're seeing. So many of these organizations have been operating, barely disturbed at all by the authorities in various kinds of ways. So we've seen this, for example, in Sweden when it comes to gang violence in general. Obviously, the police haven't been able, or the authorities at all haven't been able to really strike down against these criminals for various ideological reasons. Essentially, I think the pattern is quite recurring also in Belgium. I can imagine that it is. Sweden used to be the number one bombing capital of Europe, and now that place has actually gone to the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is suffering from a surge of the consequences of this narcotics industry that is growing, and it is obviously related to the immigration into the country. So I think this is an aspect that obviously needs to be addressed, and it's something that many people in Europe realize, but it's something that hasn't really sunk in with many people who are in power and actually have the ability to do something about this. And Belgium, I can assume, is especially vulnerable to this, considering it's the major port of the entirety of Europe. I mean, Antwerp, for example. So there's a lot of things actually entering Belgium, and that makes it a much harder to control situation than in many other countries, for example. But it's a devastating development, really. I mean, we've built this society built on law, on the rule of law, for centuries in Europe, but now it's being unraveled in just a few centuries by this naivety that has been pursued and continues to be pursued by many European politicians and people in power, and all of these criminal organizations that really have no care at all whatsoever for the public health of Europeans, for the general safety of Europeans, or for the Europeans to be able to feel that that this is their own country. This is a deadly cocktail, and that's what has brought us here.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting that you mentioned migration, because it cannot be denied that, for example, when I'm speaking about Belgium, many of sort of the foot soldiers for the narcotics mafia are illegal migrants. They have nothing to lose, these people, so they're easy prey to be used to do these things. Often also, underage kids are being used, because it's much harder, to prosecute them. Also, as I understand, that's a problem in Sweden. Now, I think both can be true at the same time. It's a part of the problem. It's not the entire problem. I think lots of the consumer base is native Europeans, and also before we used to have a lot of narcotics criminals, irrespective of immigration, in Belgium and the Netherlands. Now, again, I don't claim to be that there's any miracle solution, but if you look at the tobacco smuggling, other kinds of smuggling, but certainly tobacco, you see that even if that's not illegal, it is heavily taxed, and the higher you tax it, the more underground you push it. And in some contexts, you can make even more money with tobacco smuggling than you can with with narcotics smuggling. In parts of Brussels, there's almost open street illicit tobacco smuggling, and this is very dangerous also for public health, because then people buy this package of cigarettes that are only, let's say, 25 the price of a normal package, and they have all kinds of, they consume all kinds of metals, so it's even more damaging than normal cigarettes for your health. And then, the Belgian government or many governments are not helping either. Our health minister, Frank van den Broeke, he wants to have even higher taxes on tobacco and alternative products. And, you don't have to be a genius that, given the sort of the open border for immigration, for illicit goods, or not maybe 100% open border, but it is relatively easy to get stuff in Europe, to get people smuggled into Europe at the moment. Then, of course, this problem of organized crime, benefiting from it is going to be much bigger. Now, maybe one more thing. It's possible that if you legalize it, that some of the criminals will become respected, business people. Now, as long as they are punished for their crimes, if they then return to the sector they know, I would not necessarily personally have a problem with this, but I do predict that actually a lot of that business will be taken out of the hands from criminals. And I know that the biggest brewer, the biggest beer company in the world, which is Belgium, InBev, has been preparing for years to enter the cannabis market, hoping that it will be opened, because they have sort of all the channels by which to sell it, and it's sort of also in a way an alternative to the product they sell. So I think the most natural players to take over this illicit market, if we're talking about the real big percentage of that market, I think it's the alcohol companies.
Well, thank you, Peter and Elias, for your insights today.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you, Hannah.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.